Hello everyone, welcome at a new episode of the Pure Gospel on the Flat Earth. My name is Jouke Elsinga and today we're gonna talk about the currency scam. In previous episodes we already talked about all kinds of scams. We talked about the climate change scam, we've talked about the COVID scam, we've talked about the globe earth scam and the puppet masters who are promoting it. And also we described from a biblical viewpoint how this could have come about. We refer to 1 Titus verse 15, which talks about people's minds being corrupt and their consciences being corrupt. And we've also talked about 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 9 up to 12, which describes God sending a strong delusion to those who willfully suppress the truth and unrighteousness. Or actually, what is the case is that God allows these people to be deceived by evil people because they don't have a love for truth. So He's basically allowing the judgment to take place. Nevertheless, we have to expose the evil people just as what Christ did in His time and what John the Baptist did when he talked about King Herod, and he accused him for the fact that he committed adultery with the wife of his brother. Well, when it comes to the currency scam, it also has to be exposed, and the people behind it have to be exposed. And what we see is that it's actually a form of theft from the general public, and that governments together with bankers are conspiring against the people to take away their private property.
In 1910, Senator Nelson Aldrich summoned New York's most powerful bankers to an island off the coast of Georgia to secretly negotiate plans for an American central bank. Traveling under false names in a private railroad car, the great secrecy of this expedition would foster conspiracy theories for decades to come.
The Federal Reserve is an unconstitutional and therefore illegal monopoly on the power to counterfeit money into existence. A power that has of course been unconstitutionally granted to the bank's owners by the traitors in Congress. The reason this is all true is because the bank does not possess the money that it lends, but simply counterfeits it out of thin air. Tell me, how do you lend to others that which you do not actually possess yourself to lend?
The Federal Reserve has the power to create money. If you or I run the printing press in our basement, we're counterfeiters. When the Federal Reserve runs the printing press, the electronic printing press, it's monetary policy.
Here's the thing about the Federal Reserve. It's not federal, and there is no reserve. Every dollar in existence is owed to someone else, and not only that, but all the money in circulation is owed back to the Fed with interest. The problem with that is the money to pay the interest doesn't exist. It's never been created. This means that the Federal Reserve System is not only designed to keep us down, but also to keep us going down. The value of the dollar has been declining since the establishment of this fraudulent monetary system in 1913.
And by 1971, it was clear the dollar could no longer be exchanged into gold. Finally, President Nixon, in front of a television camera, bumping, I think, Gunsmoke off the air. It was bonanza.
Bonanza will be shown after a special report from NBC News.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
For the first time in history, the dollar was just a piece of paper, backed only by faith in the Federal Reserve and its policies. Over the next decade, the cost of living more than doubled, as the dollar lost more than half its value.
So, what's going on here? Why does the Constitution clearly state that our money shall be coined, yet we are using government-issued, supposedly official paper dollar bills? And we can't even redeem these for silver any longer. And why does Thomas Jefferson, the very man who drafted the Declaration of Independence and co-authored the U.S. Constitution, warn us about banks and corporations. Something is off here.
The notion of a central bank does not fit into the Constitution. The Congress has the authority to coin money, and only gold and silver should be legal tender. And this is an absolute contradiction of the Constitution to have a Federal Reserve System and a central bank. It was designed for the elite, and even today a lot of people don't quite understand that.
The Federal Reserve System, to most people, seems like it is an agency of the federal government. That's what I thought it was when I first started to research this topic. But it turns out that it's nothing of the kind. The Federal Reserve is a hybrid organization. It's a partnership between the federal government and the private banks. When you look at it deeper than that, its essence is neither as a government agency or a private company. In reality, it is a cartel. In other words, it's no different in essence than a banana cartel or a sugar cartel or an oil cartel.
They say that money doesn't grow on trees, but the truth is that the modern banking system creates currency far faster than trees can grow. Most people don't have a clue how currency is created. Economists and bankers make it sound so complex that people think they can't understand it. But I'm going to strip our monetary system down to its essence so that you can see the scam behind the curtain and just how it affects you. Every modern society creates currency in pretty much the same way. But since the US dollar is the majority of the world's currency, I'm going to use the United States as our example. It all starts when some politician says, "Vote for me and I'll make sure the government provides you more free stuff than my opponent will." But there's no such thing as a free lunch. So to provide that supposedly free stuff, the politicians vote for the country to spend more than its income. This is called deficit spending. To pay for that deficit spending, the Treasury borrows currency by issuing a bond. So what's a bond? If you think about it, a bond is really nothing but a glorified IOU. It's a pretty piece of paper with numbers printed on it that says, "Loan me $1 trillion today, and I promise over a 10-year period I'm going to pay you back that $1 trillion plus interest." But what you need to understand is that Treasury bonds are our national debt. These glorified IOUs are to be paid back by you and I and our descendants through future taxation. Therefore, when the government issues a bond, it steals prosperity out of the future so that it can spend it today. The Treasury then holds a bond auction, and the world's largest banks show up and compete to buy part of our national debt and make a profit on it by earning interest. You'll notice that as we move through this process, the big banks are there, taking a cut every step of the way. This isn't by chance, as you'll see shortly. Then, through a shell game called open market operations, the banks get to sell some of those bonds to the Federal Reserve at a profit. To pay for the bonds, the Federal Reserve opens up its big old checkbook and writes bad, bogus, counterfeit checks that should bounce because they're drawn on an account that always has a zero balance. There isn't one penny in there. To quote from the Boston Federal Reserve, "When you or I write a check, there must be sufficient funds in our account to cover that check. But when the Federal Reserve writes a check, there is no bank deposit on which that check is drawn. When the Federal Reserve writes a check, it is creating money." The Fed then hands those checks to the banks, and at this point, currency springs into existence. The banks then take that currency and buy more bonds at the next Treasury auction. But what is a check? A check is also an IOU. When you write a check, you're making a note that says, "Here's my IOU for cash. All you have to do is go to the bank and pick it up." Now, it's very, very important that you understand this process because we're going to come back later and show you the devastating effect this has on you. The Treasury issues IOUs, bonds. The banks then buy those IOUs with currency. The Federal Reserve then writes IOUs, checks, and hands them to the banks in exchange for the Treasury's IOUs, the bonds. And currency is created. So what's really happening is the Federal Reserve and the Treasury are just swapping IOUs, using the banks as middlemen, and abracadabra, presto, currency magically springs into existence. This process repeats and repeats over and over again, enriching the banks and indebting the public by raising the national debt. The end result is that there's a buildup of bonds at the Federal Reserve and currency at the Treasury. This process is also where all paper currency comes from. Money has to be a store of value and maintain its purchasing power over long periods of time. We learned in episode 1 that earlier in our history, our paper currency was just a claim check. It was a representation for real money of intrinsic value, the gold and silver that was held on deposit at the Treasury. You could walk into any bank and slap your currency, like say a $20 bill, on the counter and redeem it for real money, a $20 gold piece. But now, this base currency that's piling up back here is really nothing but a receipt or a claim check on an IOU, that bond. So it's really nothing but a supply of numbers. The Treasury then deposits the newly created currency into the various branches of the government, and the politicians say, "Hey, thanks for that." And the government does some deficit spending on public works, social programs, and war. The government employees, contractors, and soldiers then deposit their pay in the banks. Now, this may come as a shock to you, but when you deposit your currency with the bank, you're not actually depositing it into an account to be safely held in trust for you. Instead, you're actually loaning the bank your currency, and within certain legal limits, they can do with it pretty much anything they please. This includes gambling in the stock market and loaning it out, at a profit, of course. Now this is where the machine of currency creation really gets cranking, because this is where something called fractional reserve lending comes into play. Fractional reserve lending is exactly what it says. The banks are allowed to reserve only a fraction of your deposit and loan the rest out. Although reserve ratios may vary, I'm going to use a 10% reserve ratio as our example. If you deposit $100 in your account, the bank can legally take $90 of it and loan it out without telling you. The bank must hold $10 of your deposit in reserve just in case you want some of it. These reserves are called vault cash. But why does your bank account still say you have $100 if the bank has stolen $90 of it? Because the bank left IOUs it created, called bank credit, in its place. Now I know this sounds crazy, but here it is in black and white from the Fed. Commercial banks create checkbook money when they grant a loan simply by adding new deposit dollars in accounts on their books in exchange for a borrower's IOU. These are nothing but numbers that the banks type into their computers. And even though these bank credit IOU numbers are very different from base currency numbers, because they only exist in computers, they are still currency. So now there is $190 in existence. Now, the reason people take out loans from the banks is to buy something. They're going to buy a house or a car or something like that. So the borrower takes the $90 that the bank loaned to him from your account, and he pays the seller of the item. But then the seller deposits that currency into his account, and his bank loans out 90% of that and leaves bank credit numbers in its place. So now there's $271 in existence. This process repeats and repeats until under a 10% reserve ratio, an initial deposit of just $100 can create up to $1,000 of bank credit, all backed by $100 of vault cash, just 10%. But as I said, reserve ratios vary wildly. On some deposits, it's 10%, on others, it's 3%, and on some forms of deposits, reserve requirements are 0. The result is that the expansion of the currency supply by the banks is far greater than even this example would lead you to believe. So once again, when currency is deposited in the banks get to lend it out, and then it gets redeposited and relent, redeposited and relent, redeposited and relent over and over again, creating bank credit all the way. This is where the vast majority of our currency supply comes from. In fact, 92 to 96% of all currency in existence is created not by the government, but here in the banking system. Now, massive amounts of currency spewing into society may at first sound like a fun idea. That is, until you remember one of the most important hidden secrets of money from episode 1, that the prices of everyday goods and services act as a sponge on an expanding currency supply. The more currency we have, the more prices rise. This is where inflation comes from.
Well, the mindset of stealing away the property and the value of other people, that is what underlies the modern currency system. We can even say that the modern day banking system is some kind of a Ponzi scheme, in the sense that the money from the public is being stolen via debasing their currency, and they have been promised some kind of reward if they put their money at the banks. But obviously, when you have money at the bank, then the value of that money is being debased because there's so much inflation.
You see, the banking system in general is falling apart. And it's falling apart predictably so because it's always been a Ponzi scheme.
The banking contagion continues to unfold as UBS agreed to buy Credit Suisse, but the Swiss bank isn't in the clear yet. First Republic shares were halted during their morning tumble as First Republic plots a stock sale, and US Bancorp, USB, jetted higher on an upgrade. The FDIC secured a deal to sell most of Signature Bank assets, and central banks team up to enhance US dollar liquidity. Charles Hoskinson didn't mince words about the banking industry as a whole, calling it a Ponzi scheme that has to be stopped. In a short rant, the Cardano founder told a story of when Credit Suisse denied him a banking relationship as a CEO of Ethereum, calling it risky. The tables have completely turned, and Credit Suisse is all but done as it accepted a $3.25 billion government-driven sale to UBS Group AG. Hoskinson believes this is just the beginning of a public turnaround from banks and that the people are waking up to the real nature of their Ponzi scheme operation. Let's listen to what Charles has to say.
Things that seem permanent and stable, they change quickly. And it's something that people don't want to admit, but then after the fact, they say, oh, well, that was obvious. When I was still the CEO of Ethereum many years ago, in a past life, I tried to get a Credit Suisse account when we were in Switzerland, because, it's 2014, and the Credit Suisse people said, oh, well, it's too dangerous. Well, crypto, we couldn't possibly consider it would be so unstable and so terrible, and we have a reputation to protect. We're here for the long term. We've been here for over 150 years, and we couldn't embrace this crypto thing. And lo and behold, who's buying Credit Suisse? UBS, only if the Swiss government bails them out. You have this business where you take other people's money and then you use that to multiply and create money out of thin air, give it to people all around the world, and then you make windfall profits from it until people get a little shaky, in which case you socialize your losses and give those losses to society. And this is what's happened for years in the banking industry. We've witnessed the US dollar lose more than 95% of its value over the last 100 years. We've witnessed the last 3 years alone, the supply of money in the United States double. We've witnessed so much evil, just reprehensible behavior by the banking industry. The escape valve has been cryptocurrencies. It gives us the ability to go into the digital space and take money to the next level, put people back in charge, embrace full reserve, all this type of stuff. And you know what's happened? The governments are coming in saying crypto caused this problem, not the trillions of dollars of money printing, not the fractional reserve banking system, but crypto caused this problem, not the rampant corruption, not the nepotism, not the U.S. warfare culture that we've had, 9 countries over the last 23 years, $15 trillion in wars. None of that has anything to do with it. Not shutting down the entire world for COVID. No, none of that has anything to do with all of this stuff. No.
So we see that we're dealing with some gigantic Ponzi scheme, which is defended and supported by the governments.
Commissioner, Mr. President, I rise again, I'm afraid, to make the same old hoary speech that I've been making here for several years, and that is, it is my opinion that you do not really understand the concept of banking. All the banks are broke. Bank Santander, Deutsche Bank, Royal Bank of Scotland, they're all broke. And why are they broke? It isn't some sort of tsunami. They're broke because we have a system called fractional reserve banking, which means that banks can lend money that they don't actually have. It's a criminal scandal, and it's been going on for too long. To add to that problem, you have moral hazard, a very significant moral hazard from the political sphere. And most of the problem starts in politics and central banks, which are part of the same political system. We have counterfeiting, sometimes called quantitative easing, but counterfeiting by any other name. The artificial printing of money, which if any ordinary person did, they'd go to prison for a very long time. And yet governments and central banks do it all the time. Central banks repress the amount of interest that rates are, so we don't have the real cost of money. And yet we blame the retail banks for manipulating LIBOR. The sheer effrontery of this is quite astonishing. It's central banks that manipulate interest rates, Commissioner. And plus, underneath all this, we talk loosely, in a rather cavalier fashion, do we not, about deposit guarantees. So when banks go broke through their own incompetence and chicanery, the taxpayer picks up the tab. It's theft from the taxpayer. And until we start sending bankers, and I include central bankers and politicians, to prison for this outrage, it will continue.
Just some time ago, there was some guy and he told me that we have to give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Christ acknowledges the fact that we have to pay our taxes, we have to contribute to the common good, but this is something completely different as to be okay with theft. We need to have the mindset of Christ. He exposed what is evil and we need to do the same. We can read about this in Ephesians 5 verse 11. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. Well, let me be also obvious about the fact that we should not love money. Money in itself is nothing more than a medium of exchange. It's just to facilitate the trade and the exchange between two kinds of goods, of services, to just form some kind of medium between it, and it has no value or no worth by itself. To be obsessed with it is some form of idolatry, and we should also not be obsessed by material stuff in this world. We should not long for that, and we should certainly not borrow money for it. In fact, if you are borrowing money, then you contribute to everyone else's money being debased. Because as you borrow money, more money will come into circulation, and this basically drives down the value of everyone else's money. So that for that reason I am not for borrowing money in general. In fact, I am for the idea of a jubilee in which debt is being forgiven, and that is actually what we need right now. And the money that all those bankers are taking from the public obviously has to come back. So I think it's important that we expose this. Everyone has to unite in this. We should not try to profiteer from borrowing money, because that is ultimately bad for everyone else. So there you have it for today. Thank you all for watching. Hopefully you've learned something. If you have any questions or something, just feel free to drop them in the comment box. And we hope to see you in the next episode of the Pure Gospel on the Flat Earth.